Hi, I'm Jerry Davis from the University of Michigan, and welcome to our panel on evidence from implementing strategies for aligning research with societal needs. And I'm delighted to introduce David Hart, a professor at the University of Maine and director of the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. Ever since he became embroiled at the age of 17 in a controversial proposal regarding the environmental and economic future of a coastal California watershed, David's been searching for ways to increase the value of science in society. Along the way, he's conducted a wide range of environmental research, served as a science advisor to the government, the private sector, and NGOs, and developed innovative programs to address pressing challenges at the intersection of environmental, social, and economic issues. For more than a decade, David and his colleagues have been growing the capacity of universities to conduct stakeholder-engaged interdisciplinary research, which led to the creation of the Senator George J. Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. So David, welcome, and we're excited to learn more about your initiative.
Thank you, Jerry. It's great to be here. And I just want to start by saying that it's a pleasure to talk about the work that my colleagues and I have been doing. It turns out we're almost going on the 15-year mark now. And many of us felt that in our own research and collectively across the whole university, that we were falling short of our hope that our work would help society solve some complex problems. And so we headed out on a big adventure to see whether we could do any better. And that's what I'll be talking about now. We know there are a lot of complex societal problems, and we picked one of them. We think it's a fairly both big but also representative. It's the problem of sustainable development, which is both about the well-being of society and the well-being of the natural world and the many connections between them. And we know that any one faculty member's area of expertise, and in fact, all of academic expertise, isn't enough to help us understand and solve these problems. We're going to have to work with a lot of partners who have their own values and goals and their own knowledge and know-how about these issues. They live and breathe these every day, right? So we're going to have to put our heads together. And that's what we've been doing for a number of years. And you might sort of say, well, it ought to be pretty simple, right? Universities could start by just saying, let's focus on these real world problems, which among other things means we're going to have to get to know the stakeholders who have a lot of relevant experience dealing with those problems and ideas about the solutions. In our own case, as researchers, we're going to have to bring a lot of different kinds of disciplinary expertise, methods to the work. And there is no field guide for doing this, at least not a complete one. We can get some tips from a lot of different people, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to learn as we go. So this is the rough formula we've been using, and we've learned a lot along the way. So when I say focus on real world problems in Maine, this has caused us to look at issues related to the management of natural resources and the working communities that are connected to those resources. We have a lot of forests in Maine. There are all sorts of issues there, including down in the lower left. You might not think about the fact that indigenous peoples have been living in Maine for millennia, making baskets from brown ash, just one of a bunch of species of trees. Unfortunately, we now have an invasive forest pest, the emerald ash borer, that's decimating brown ash or is expected to in the coming decades. So that's a complex interaction for sure. Many people know about the iconic lobster fishery, lots of things going on there that need attention, not just climate change, but tariffs strongly influence the resilience of that system. We're doing a lot of work on renewable energy. Climate is affecting Maine just like everywhere else. We have increasing extreme precipitation that's blowing out culverts and making our transportation infrastructure more vulnerable. We also do a lot of work with Maine's nearly 500 municipalities, that some of whom are dealing with things like sprawl, but others are almost vanishing from the map as paper mills close and they wonder what their futures look like. So lots of different kinds of problems. We have a portfolio of projects, more than 70 that we've launched to date. You hear this expression a lot about meeting people where they are, our partners, our stakeholders. It's at least as much art as it is science here in Eastport on Cobscook Bay. This is Teresa Johnson, who's a human ecologist, brilliant researcher, but she also grew up in Mid-Coast Maine, has had people fishing in her family for generations. So she brings both the academic and real world experience to these interactions with fishers to help them think about balancing their own work with the growing interest in tidal energy in that region. So we really believe that you're more likely to be able to understand and solve these problems if you mobilize diverse teams. We started, by the way, with just a handful of researchers. Almost all of them were men. They were relatively far along in their careers. They were almost all natural scientists. The original meeting, I think, was less than 10 of us in a room. I'm happy to say that we've expanded a lot. We now have, over 200 faculty. Half of them are social scientists, meaning they have this human dimensions expertise, all different ranks from early career, mid-career, and late career. So we've mixed things up a lot, and each team is different depending on the problems and the partners. We have made some progress. This is one way to summarize it. We've received a lot of funding just from the NSF alone, over 40 million in grants over a period of a little more than 10 years. A lot of research papers. I mentioned more than 200 faculty from a lot of different disciplines. We started at the University of Maine in Orono, and we've expanded across 22 institutions in New England. Lots of early career people, meaning undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, and a lot of stakeholder partners from a business and industry, all levels of government, diverse non-governmental organizations, and Maine's tribal nations, all for the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Micmac, and Maliseet. This is just gives you a sense of the range of partners. This is way less than a 20th of the partners we've worked with, but they're really important relationships. Increasingly, they come to us asking for our help, which is great. We started out probably more us going and asking whether there were ways we could add value to their work. This is one example of this. This is Rich Redner, who's a planner down in Topsom, and he is. We were working with him in an area where they were trying to do community and economic development work that also required being real careful about wetland protection. The federal government has a lot to say about not destroying wetlands, but wetlands are complicated. They're everywhere in the landscape, and if you want to grow either residential or commercial real estate development, you got to be real careful. And what he appreciated was our ability to look at the big picture as well as the individual pieces of the puzzle, and to realize that is a balancing act. We've had I just had an email right before I got on today with someone from state government asking for our help. It happens a lot. It's a gratifying experience. So when you engage with stakeholders, I mean, you can do some of it by the seat of the pants, but we really believe that we need a stronger empirical basis for figuring out the best ways to do stakeholder engagement or interdisciplinary collaboration. So this is a paper from a few years ago by Karen Bielik and her colleagues. She did her dissertation with us at the time and basically looked at the nearly 500 municipalities in Maine to understand how local government officials, what kind of collaboration preferences they have. So let's see. We did a big survey. There was also qualitative research in connection with this, but this is quantitative. It's a model that was developed, a discrete choice regression model, looking at partnership preferences. The dependent variable is kind of whether you'd prefer more of a consultative role or facilitation or other models of, let me just think about that. Other kind of full partnerships, maybe more like what people would call a co-production strategy, and what predicts people's preferences. In other words, not everybody has the same kind of preference. Some of the factors that predicted those preferences include prior experience working with university researchers, the level of trust that exists, how severe the problem is, and other issues related to the costs and benefits of collaboration. So these kinds of studies can help guide our engagement strategies, and we've done a lot of them. In fact, we've published over 60 papers. There's a link at the bottom of this slide that can take you to many of those papers that are all about developing an empirical basis for best practices for stakeholder engagement and interdisciplinary teamwork. Just the first title, Turning Contention into Collaboration, Engaging Power, Trust, and Learning in Collaborative Networks. So that's Vanessa Levesque and her colleagues. She also did her dissertation with us, and now she's on the faculty at the University of Southern Maine. And this was working with Maine municipalities on collaboration. So another some quantitative and some qualitative research on how to build a strong collaboration, and a lot more work like that. So one of the things that happened, partly because we got some of these big NSF grants, our first one was actually 20 million. Thank you very much, National Science Foundation, is that you get a lot of external assessment of your work when you get that much funding, which is entirely appropriate. And so when the AAAS came in to do an external evaluation very early on in our work, they said this in their report: one of the most impressive things about the Mitchell Center is that interdisciplinarity is truly central to its work. Nothing is forced. Indeed, the interdisciplinary nature of the research seems to be one of the central elements that draws people to the Mitchell Center. Well, I would just say that I think they saw this before we did. We were so busy trying to figure out how to do any of this that we didn't quite realize that we had begun to change the culture of the institution. I'll come back to that point. And it's also true that it wasn't just on campus. People started to be aware of this. We have faculty several that have left Ivy League universities to come to the University of Maine. That's not usually the pathway to glory and prestige, but they came to the University of Maine to work on these kinds of problems because they actually thought this was a more conducive environment for that kind of work, which is very interesting. So another core value of our work, and this varies with each of the collaborations, is that we really have to focus on equity and justice. And when we started, we knew that one of the collaborations we wanted to see if we could build and turn it into something more productive than past collaborations was with Maine's tribal nations. I mentioned the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Micmac, and Maliseet. This is a paper that came out earlier this year that talks about the lessons we've learned trying to think about productive pathways for using both Western science and Indigenous science to work together. And this is a fascinating paper. It's gotten some great global reviews by other people, but just one example of why I think this is a path-breaking piece of work is that of the 12 authors of this paper, 8 are tribal members. And we have tribal faculty and tribal students that are absolutely outstanding. We couldn't do this work if it weren't for them. I mentioned we do a lot of research on what we actually called this at first, the research on the research, meaning we're trying to study everything about interdisciplinarity. This was a study led by Bridie McGreevy and her colleagues on what kind of leadership methods contribute to success or maybe contribute to not such success in these teams. There's a lot of both regular sort of linear statistical analyses, but also a bunch of multivariate analyses. I won't go into the details of that in the first part of the quote, but the bottom line is that all of those results showed that teams that used a kind of top-down single-person decision-making experienced reduced individual satisfaction by team members and slower and no progress towards goals. Bottom line, shared leadership takes you farther. And we've had plenty of examples of teams that just haven't made it. Not saying there's anything wrong with that. You can learn a lot from mistakes and failures, but if you want to go farther, we're helping to identify in our own work what are some of those best practices are. And we've had a lot of converts for our work. This is Arya Amarbaman, a wonderful guy, a professor in civil and environmental engineering, fortunately no longer at UMaine, but still a great colleague. And when he started out, he's like many of us, he sort of said, I'm not sure I get this. Why would I be trying to work with social scientists? But he stuck with it. He worked with a wonderful social scientist, Firuza Pavri, who's a geographer who now is the head of the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine. And within a short amount of time, this was one of the stories he told in an article about his work. He said, this work is extremely meaningful for me. In academia, your papers are often read by just a handful of other people. But if we can make a societal change, even if it's incremental, that would be a huge contribution. He's not alone. in deciding that this is worth all the trouble, if you will. Another example, I was with an early career researcher. She was partway towards a tenure decision. We were working with some stakeholders along coastal Maine who had some fishery concerns. They were taking us to show us what they were wrestling with, if you will. And along the way, we were sitting in the boat together, and she was telling me a story about all the great mentors who were giving her advice about how to be well prepared when she goes up for tenure. A lot of that advice was stay in your lanes, sharpen your focus, pick a real small area, and make sure that is the excellent work you do. And I think she found this a little helpful, but not sufficient, because it wasn't really going at something else that was very important to her, which is this work with stakeholders. And she leaned over to me as we were going across this choppy bay in a lot of wind, so nobody else could hear her. And she said, like I'll ever stop doing this, by which she meant working with stakeholders on real world problems, even though it didn't exactly fit perfectly the advice she was getting from great mentors. And by the way, she got tenure with flying colors. She's a brilliant researcher in her own field, but she's also great at this work. At the end of the day, we think this is about changing the culture. In fact, we think it's about developing a shared ethos. I don't know how many people do this, but when I go into buildings and universities around the world, I'm often curious, like, what do they stand for? I don't usually walk into a building where the ethos is a statement on the wall as you come into the building, but it is at the Mitchell Center. The ethos of the Mitchell Center reflects one of my deepest beliefs, the importance of public service. The center's faculty and students have committed themselves to a goal larger than their individual lives, the goal of helping build a better world. I'm not saying everybody looks at it every time they come in the building, but we hope it's kind of sinking in a little bit like being in the water, but we think it's taking hold, it's taking root. We know it is. By the way, we've done a lot of our own research about our own lessons that we're learning, but we need a lot more comparative analyses of lessons learned at different universities, because they're going to vary, right? Big universities, small universities, rural universities, urban universities, Ivy League universities, public land grants. This was actually a paper that emerged from a previous AAAS session that I helped organize with wonderful colleagues. This represented 6 universities across the country to compare and contrast what we were learning from our initiatives. But my gosh, we were just scraping the surface of what we need to know about this. One size will not fit all. So I want to conclude with a couple slides about strategies for accelerating university change. And this is guidance for everybody, university leaders, the kind of groups of faculty like we've brought together, as well as external funders. I know that Vivian Singh is speaking in this session, and she's doing great work at WT Grant to help accelerate change. I would say one thing is to provide patient capital. We're not going to change culture overnight. A one-year grant won't get you there. We're going to have to stick with this for a while, including by creating a risk-tolerant culture and recognizing that we'll make mistakes, but that we can learn from them. I think we can help steer faculty to problems and collaborations that might be more likely to bear fruit. And I'm happy to say that in doing so, we have many collaborations that have been going for more than a decade. I don't expect them to stop anytime soon, even as the work that they're doing has morphed as the world changes. We need to do a lot more training and mentoring. We do a lot of that there, but boy, does it have to be about teamwork. And we need to give the kind of recognition that will help faculty and students and others be successful. Every single faculty member who's worked on these projects has gotten tenure and promotion, but that requires some special attention to the unique circumstances in, say, their home departments and schools. We do a lot of that at the Mitchell Center. We work closely with faculty to help them navigate those challenges. We also help them get recognition out in the media. We help them, lots of our faculty, because they are working on real world problems, are also getting recognition from people in state government and other leaders in Maine. Last slide. There are great opportunities for people who might be thinking, gee, I want to invest in changing the world, and I think universities are part of what it will take to get us there, which I firmly believe, by the way. But just because universities say they're committed to excellence, which is a common kind of a core value doesn't mean they're going to be skilled at this kind of work. In fact, some of the greatest innovation is occurring at smaller universities that might be called off the beaten path. And I'm sure Jerry can tell you way more about how often innovation in business takes place, not by the Goliaths, but some of the startups. And accelerating change in some of the most elite institutions is actually more expensive. A quick example, had somebody come from an Ivy League university tell me that senior leaders were trying to incentivize this kind of collaboration between economists and environmental scientists. And I said, how do they do it? They give seed grants. I asked how much. He said, $200K, they're giving out these grants to help us get started. We do that for $20K at the University of Maine. So we're not only 90% cheaper to incentivize that change, but according to my colleagues at those Ivy League institutions, we also have a better success rate in actually turning it into real world solutions. So if you want to know more about this work, we published a paper last year in Issues in Science and Technology, and thank you very much.
Oh, David, thank you so much. I've learned a ton from your talk and found it really engaging. I wanted to drill down on a couple of the questions that came up for me during your talk. So one thing that you alluded to is the promotion and tenure and evaluation system in universities. Yeah. So universities have a very long tradition of evaluating work in its own lane and promoting work that contributes directly to A journals and citations. And I'm wondering, how does this work land when it comes to sort of promotion and tenure? How do you reassure faculty, and what procedures do you have in place to make sure that they get positively evaluated for doing the kind of research you're describing here?
Yeah, so you're exactly right that this is a very important challenge to pay attention to. As I mentioned, all our faculty have gotten promotion and tenure. But it's required, and it varies depending on the department or school that they're in. But we start at the very outset trying to understand what the expectations are. I have worked myself with peer committees, as well as the faculty, with department chairs, with deans, with provosts, with presidents and vice presidents for research. That's one of the things we do to help faculty manage those risks. I'll say that, of course, it will always be the case, I think, that some internal and external reviewers will say, how excellent are you in your field? But when you have faculty that are co-PIs on a $20 million grant or two $6 million grants, and they have way more publications, maybe not just in their one area, but in a whole lot of areas, especially as universities are sort of saying, maybe we got to start doing more than we used to do and changing our formula. It's working for us, but I do think that's a reason that some institutions aren't going to be the early innovators here. I just heard Ira Shapiro give a talk at Yale. He's a political scientist, and he said 1 in 9 faculty in political science get tenure there. If I were an early career there, I bet I would be pretty risk averse. It's not, that bar isn't as high where I am. I came from an Ivy League institution to the University of Maine because I thought this was a more conducive environment for doing this. So that's kind of my point about investment opportunities might vary as well.
Yeah, and can you say a word about how universities vary in this way? Like you mentioned the split between sort of Ivy League schools and other schools, but why do universities vary so much in how they evaluate this work and promote it?
Well, somebody ought to, later on, Jerry, I'd love to talk to you about how we might study this. I think we don't have enough data, but obviously, I think land grant universities have an ethos. It's not entirely good ethos in some ways about its history, but I think it's more mission driven. And for those institutions that are all about excellence, I keep asking myself, excellent for what? Like, it's great to push back the frontiers of knowledge. I've done that in my career. I get it, but we can do more than that. Some universities, I think, will be slower to make these changes, but I hope all of them will get better at this. We're not trying to stop that other work. We're trying to enlarge the space for this kind of work as well.
And suppose you were a foundation or some other external funding. What can you do to catalyze this kind of change at universities?
Wow, I think they can be full partners in this, and that's why I admire the work of WT Grant and other funders, is that they can They can sometimes they know more about the promising low-hanging fruit for partnerships with stakeholders. They can help provide recognition for faculty in various ways, including awards, but also media coverage. They can sit down with presidents and vice presidents for research and provosts and say, we want to support you, but we need you guys to help. You got to meet us halfway.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor David Hart. We really appreciate your panel. This is one of three sessions, one of three talks as part of the panel, Evidence from Implementing Strategies for Aligning Research with Societal Needs. I hope you watch all three and that you will join us in February. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jerry.